It was never supposed to be spoken aloud, never to be written down, but I want you to imagine this: a priest, screaming, bound in chains beneath a seminary built for God, and 3 men, not priests, not even believers, watching him suffocate beneath the earth, whispering prayers to something older than Christ. Something darker. For 18 years, 19 men vanished from Sacred Heart Seminary, and every single one of them had one thing in common: they trusted the cloth. Tonight, we burn that cloth. We're not here to mourn the innocent. We're here to expose the predators. If you listen to what I'm about to tell you, you will not be the same man you were before you clicked this video. This is not content. This is initiation. Welcome to the altar of silence. You've already heard the surface story, the version cleaned up for the faint of heart. 17 priests gone, supposedly transferred. That's the bait. But what if I told you there weren't just 17, there were 19? 2 names were removed not by mistake, but to protect a secret so large, the Vatican sealed it for 150 years. The difference between 17 and 19 is the difference between mystery and conspiracy. Let's start where it all begins. 1847, Illinois. The land was raw, unforgiving, but perfect for secrets. The seminary stood alone, not by accident, but by design, built 40 miles from the nearest town, on land bought for a fraction of its worth by a man who didn't exist in any census before 1845, a man known only as Edmund Walsh. And here's where it gets sickening. All 3 men running the school had no ecclesiastical lineage, no legitimate holy orders. The Catholic Church has a process. Ordination is documented. These men, ghosts, but what's worse is how they became priests. 3 real clergy were sent from Ireland to start the seminary. They never made it past New York Harbor. Their bodies were found 2 years later, buried under a tavern in 5 Points, throats cut, dog collars still on. But before the church could investigate, the seminary was already up and running, under new leadership. It's like someone needed it open, fast. Now ask yourself, why would 3 imposters go through the trouble of building a seminary, complete with real curriculum, real theology, real structure, just to vanish students into thin air? The answer: they weren't just abducting, they were harvesting, not organs, not bodies, but faith, and converting it into something else, something marketable, something demonic. And that's only the beginning. Keep listening. The church teaches us to fear hell, but hell isn't beneath us. It's built into the architecture of power, and sometimes it wears robes. Michael Brennan was the first. His name still appears on early rosters. A golden boy, top of his class in Latin, gifted in debate, loved by faculty and peers alike. He wasn't the kind of young man who runs. He was the kind of man you build cathedrals around. But Michael vanished on a February night so cold the breath froze before it left your lungs. They said he left to minister to cholera victims in Iowa. Brave, noble, holy, except it was a lie. He didn't take his coat. He didn't take his boots. And he left behind his grandmother's rosary, an heirloom that never left his side. His roommate, Joseph Kennedy, raised the alarm. But instead of answers, he was punished, locked in a freezing basement chapel for daring to question authority. That's not discipline, that's control. Psychological warfare dressed as penance. And that's when Joseph began to hear the sounds, not in dreams, not in visions, but real, physical sounds that shook the stones beneath the seminary. Horses, wagons, chains, at 2 a.m. every night, in the dead of winter, when no sane man would travel and no roads could carry wheels, but someone was moving cargo. Living cargo. Joseph would later write, "I believed I was in hell, not seminary. The devil wore the face of a bishop." Those pages were never meant to be seen. We only know of them because they were found in 1972 during an unauthorized renovation, hidden behind the basement altar, bound in waxed linen and sealed with twine. His testimony was raw, fevered. almost illegible, but the fear bled through the ink. Now understand this. Michael wasn't the last. Over the next 18 years, 18 more men vanished, never during summer, always in winter, always during storms or blizzards, as if nature itself was colluding in the disappearances. The records list transfers, yes, to missions in the frontier or spiritual retreats in South America, but none of them were ever seen again. No letters, no graves, no final sacraments. You may think, surely someone would have spoken up, but here's the thing about institutions built on guilt. They don't need chains. They make you hold the key to your own silence. These young men had given their entire lives to the church. Leaving meant more than walking away from God. It meant exile. It meant shame. It meant being unmade. But there's more. Because in 1863, after 19 disappearances and mounting suspicion, Sacred Heart Seminary burned to the ground, and not a single body was found. Not in the ashes, not in the snow. Gone, like smoke. Still want to go deeper? Good, because the next truth doesn't just rewrite history, it rewrites you. You ever wonder why fire is always the final chapter of forbidden places? It's not to destroy, it's to sanctify. It's ritual, and Sacred Heart wasn't destroyed to erase evidence. It was offered, like a sacrifice. The official report said lightning struck the bell tower, that the fire spread too quickly for anyone to escape. But that's impossible. The storm that night was dry, no thunder, no lightning, not a single drop of rain recorded by the Millfield town barometer. But by dawn, the entire structure was gone. The bell itself, 800 pounds of Bavarian bronze, melted into the basement. Yet the stone altar beneath it, untouched, as if the fire had known where to burn. What if I told you someone watched that fire, not from afar but up close? Not a witness, a participant. In 1927, a letter was found inside the hollow spine of a cathedral statue in Milwaukee, stuffed behind the wooden ribs of St. Bartholomew. It was signed with the initials J.K. Joseph Kennedy, the only surviving student from the original Sacred Heart class. He had fled, disappeared for decades, and re-emerged only in fragments, whispered through family lines like some cursed tale. His letter, now locked in a private archive, reads, "We watched it burn from the tree line. Walsh, Murphy, and O'Brien stood barefoot in the snow, arms raised to a sky that didn't answer. The flames weren't orange. They were blue, blue like gaslight, blue like cold fire. They chanted something in Latin, but not the Latin we knew, not church Latin, older, more primal. My teeth cracked in my mouth just hearing it." Let that settle. 3 men, barefoot in the dead of winter, not mourning, celebrating. Blue fire is hotter, cleaner, and it leaves less behind. After the fire, the land was purchased, not by the church, but by a private holding company based out of Luxembourg. It was never rebuilt, never reclaimed. And for over a century it sat abandoned. But satellite photos from 2009 showed something strange. Scorch marks. New ones, in the shape of a cross, no buildings, no utilities, just blackened grass, forming a perfect cruciform shadow in the prairie. Why mark a field that no one visits, unless someone's still using it? Now let me ask you something personal. Really. Ask you. How many things do you think your government, your religion, your parents have hidden in plain sight? How many times have you felt a warning in your gut and ignored it? Don't. Not tonight. Because once we cross the halfway point, you'll have a choice. Leave with a story, or descend with me into a secret you were born to carry. But if you're still here, prepare yourself. We're going deeper than history allows. Names have power, but what's more powerful is when names disappear. That's exactly what happened after the fire at Sacred Heart Seminary. 19 men, their names in registers, letters, photographs, vanished, erased from church ledgers, erased from diocesan logs. Even families, when pressed years later, said the same chilling phrase, "We were told not to ask." But here's where it becomes undeniable. In 1889, Bishop Alphonse de la Rue of Milwaukee was conducting a review of long-forgotten church properties across the Midwest. a bureaucratic exercise, clean the books, close out assets. But when his archivists opened the files related to Sacred Heart, they found something they weren't prepared for. A sealed dossier marked Excellentio, Classis Tui. Inside, not theology, not student transcripts, but psychological profiles. Dossiers on every student ever admitted between 1847 and 1865. Detailed assessments, not of faith, but of obedience thresholds, trauma response, and susceptibility to suggestion. It wasn't spiritual formation, it was behavioral conditioning, early mind control. Every student had been catalogued like a lab subject. Joseph Kennedy, for instance, was flagged in Latin, intellectus fortis, voluntas periculosa. Strong intellect, dangerous will. That's why he was punished. Not for doubt, but for resisting programming. So I ask you, what kind of seminary records obedience thresholds, and who were those reports sent to? Because none of them were addressed to any diocese. Every envelope bore a sigil that even Vatican scholars couldn't identify. A twisted Ouroboros encircling a crucified man, upside down. Now remember this, the Church has fought heresies for 2,000 years. It has excommunicated saints, burned mystics, and silenced reformers, but it has never publicly acknowledged the existence of this symbol, because it's not heresy. It's something older than heresy. And it shows up again, in 1938, in a classified report from the U.S. Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA. The OSS had launched an operation called Project Reliquary, investigating occult activity in abandoned Catholic institutions across the Midwest. And in their findings, unredacted only in 2001, they mention Sacred Heart Seminary and a coded artifact recovered from beneath its ruins, a carved altar stone bearing the exact same Ouroboros crucifix symbol, along with a phrase etched in ancient Latin, Lux fit per obedientium, mors fit per claritatem. Light comes through obedience. Death comes through clarity. This wasn't a church. It was a machine. Not to teach theology, but to break minds. To mold men not into saints, but servants. Silent, disposable, useful. Now before we continue, if you're still with me, if this voice inside your gut has started to whisper things you can't unhear, I want you to comment this phrase below. Obedience is blindness, I see now. Type it twice, not for the algorithm, but for you. Because once you write it, there's no going back. Not mentally, not spiritually, not ever. Next, we're going into the tunnels. Because yes, there were tunnels. And what they led to may explain everything. They say God is above, but the real rituals, the ones that change a man forever, always happen underground. Sacred Heart. Seminary wasn't just a building, it was a fortress with roots. Hidden beneath its manicured chapel and lecture halls were 5 subterranean chambers, not cellars, not wine storage. These were hand-carved vaults, reinforced with limestone and sealed with wrought iron. Students were told they were old Jesuit meditation chambers, relics of a spiritual tradition passed down in silence. But that was a lie. One the brick didn't keep quiet about. In 1964, a construction crew doing soil sampling for a proposed farmland irrigation system hit something unusual. Stonework. Perfectly aligned, circular architecture beneath layers of untouched prairie. The team unearthed a sealed tunnel entrance, leading 17 feet down into what one described as a crypt built for silence. What they found wasn't sacred. It was surgical. The first chamber had hooks, embedded in the stone, spaced shoulder-width apart, blood grooves carved into the floor, burn marks, no crosses, no icons, just the smell of rusted metal and something older, the scent of damp books and decay. The second chamber was a scriptorium, still intact, desks bolted to the floor as if expecting a struggle, chains attached to each writing station, and every wall covered with symbols, Latin prayers twisted into spirals, fragments of Hebrew and Greek fused into gibberish, and one phrase, etched over and over in every language, "The mind must forget to become clean." But the third chamber, that's where all doubts die. Photographs were taken, never released. But one man, a surveyor named Dean Harker, leaked his journal before he disappeared. His words, "It's not just that they were experimenting, it's that they succeeded. I saw diagrams, not of human anatomy, but of behavioral schematics. Rituals tied to psychological triggers, sounds mapped to obedience, light sequences matched to confession responses. This wasn't theology, this was engineering compliance." He described a pulpit made entirely of bone, not symbolic, but assembled vertebrae, and above it, that same Ouroboros crucifix, carved into a glass disc designed to refract light onto the face of the speaker. A spotlight. These priests weren't preaching, they were programming. You still think this was about missing men? It was never about 19. It was about what they represented. Raw material, souls stripped down, rewritten, and, according to one unsealed document from the OSS, sold. To who? That's the question they sealed under Vatican Level 4 classification. But if the tunnels went that deep, just wait until you hear what they were connected to. Underground isn't the end, it's the network. When we talk about tunnels beneath Sacred Heart, we're not just describing some old stone chambers. We're talking about arteries, pathways that connected that seminary to something much larger, an unseen infrastructure of shadow and silence that ran across the Midwest like a circulatory system for secrets. How do we know this? Because in 1978, two spelunkers from Illinois State University, mapping what they believed was a natural cave system near the Des Plaines River, broke through a limestone wall and found themselves standing in a man-made corridor. Arched ceiling, iron sconces, faded paint resembling ecclesiastical patterns. But there was no chapel above them, just woods. It was a tunnel, measured to extend northeast, straight toward the ruins of Sacred Heart, nearly 16 miles away. Now ask yourself, why would a seminary, built in 1845, require miles of underground passageways connecting it to what exactly? There were no sister churches, no official underground railroad ties, no wartime function. Yet the construction was deliberate, engineered, and worse, replicated. Because that tunnel wasn't alone. Over the next 2 decades, similar corridors were discovered beneath 4 other Catholic institutions built between 1830 and 1860, all in rural areas, all abandoned after unexplained fires or financial collapse. The floor plans were nearly identical, and in each case, survivors or town elders mentioned the same pattern. Students gone missing, replaced without mention, priests with no past, and strange wagons arriving in the dead of night. No names, no cargo lists, no return. You're seeing it now, aren't you? Sacred Heart wasn't an anomaly. It was a node. But it gets worse, because in 1994, a team of archaeologists working on a completely unrelated excavation near Galena, Illinois, nearly 90 miles from the seminary site, unearthed a sealed stone hatch buried beneath what had once been a Jesuit retreat. When they opened it, they didn't find relics. They found a stone vault, carved with the Ouroboros crucifix, inside a parchment scroll wrapped in human hair, and a map. A network diagram, not of roads, not of tunnels, but of ritual transfer points. Places where bodies were moved, where minds were broken, where conversions, not of faith but of identity, took place. And right at the center, written in red iron ink, Cor Sanctum, Nodus Primus. Sacred Heart, primary node. This wasn't one seminary's secret. It was an operation, a pipeline. And if that map was right, it didn't end in Illinois. It extended east, toward Ohio, Pennsylvania, even D.C. Now think back to everything you've ever read about mind control, black sites, secret orders, missing boys, and whispers about what lies beneath cathedrals and monuments. You're not crazy. You were just never meant to connect the dots. But we're not done, because what came out of those tunnels? That's the part no one dares talk about. not even in a whisper. Every system produces something. Even hell has output. So what came out of the Sacred Heart tunnels? Not bodies. Those were lost, scattered, or dissolved beneath layers of limestone and centuries of denial. What came out were men. Men who looked the same, spoke the same, but weren't. I want you to imagine this. A 21-year-old seminarian disappears in 1853, officially transferred. His mother receives a single letter 6 weeks later, written in her son's handwriting, but cold, detached. No warmth, no humor, just a formal farewell and a quote from Scripture, then silence. 20 years later, in 1874, a man shows up in Missouri, preaching in a traveling mission. He claims to be the same boy, but his voice is different, his gait is different, and when he tries to bless the sick, the cross in his hand burns his own skin. Sound far-fetched? Maybe. But 5 separate families across 3 states reported identical experiences between 1870 and 1900, sons who vanished, only to return changed. And in every case, the parish they arrived in soon collapsed into scandal, financial ruin, or fire. They weren't men anymore. They were vessels. This wasn't just human trafficking. This was replacement, programming, and reinsertion. What the church couldn't do with truth, it did with obedience. Take a boy, strip him, break him, rebuild him, and return him to society as a weapon wearing a cassock. You've heard of Operation Paperclip? Nazi scientists folded into American institutions after World War II. Sacred Heart was spiritually similar, but older, more insidious, because it didn't just recruit evil, it manufactured it, quietly, under the guise of holiness. And here's the most terrifying part. This wasn't just the church. In 1911, an anonymous Vatican informant, a clerk who had access to sealed seminary archives, mailed a package to the Berlin Institute for Psychological Warfare. It contained 68 pages of detailed notes on Sacred Heart's conditioning protocol. These documents referenced not theology, but something called the Shepherd's Model, a sequence of 5 psychological breaks designed to erase identity, reprogram emotional response, and produce perfect loyalty to any assigned ideology. What does that sound like to you? Because to me it sounds like pre-CIA psychological operations, like MK Ultra, before MK Ultra. Think about that. A rural seminary in 1847 running the blueprint for modern mind control, before the science even had a name. But they weren't just making obedient clergy, they were testing prototypes. And the question becomes, for who? Because if you still believe this ends at the church, you're not paying attention. There's always a sponsor, always a hand behind the curtain. And at Sacred Heart, that hand didn't wear a rosary, it wore a ring. Let's break this wide open. In 1852, a ledger was discovered, a hidden financial book belonging to Rector Thomas Murphy, one of the impostor priests. It listed dozens of entries, dates, amounts, initials, but it wasn't tuition, it was payment. Every line marked with one of 2 Latin phrases. Anima donata. Soul given. Anima usurpata. Soul taken. These were transactions. And the buyers? Not bishops, not parishes, but private clients. Initials cross-referenced later with Masonic registries, banking archives, and land ownership records. What they discovered shattered every illusion of spiritual innocence. The men funding Sacred Heart were not clergy. They were industrialists, judges, and government agents. Names like Hartford, Wilkes, Marston, all prominent in railroad construction and Midwestern law enforcement at the time. And one especially chilling name appeared 12 times, R.D. Ashcroft, a founding partner in the Central Illinois Railway and known donor to the First National Bank of Chicago. But Ashcroft never appeared on any church registry. He was a Freemason, 33rd degree. And in a rare journal entry discovered after his death, he wrote, "The priesthood is an outdated machine, but their subjects, oh, their subjects are perfect, conditioned, guilt-wired, ready." The next evolution of loyalty begins with confession. He wasn't funding salvation. He was funding behavioral templates. This was more than exploitation, it was development. Men were being tested, not just for obedience to God, but for obedience to power. Strip away the dogma, and what remained was something useful, programmable, deployable. What's more, multiple Sacred Heart graduates appeared later in institutions that had nothing to do with ministry. One was assigned as a chaplain to the Illinois State Penitentiary, and 2 years later, that prison implemented the first known solitary confinement rehabilitation program. Another disappeared into the U.S. Cavalry and resurfaced in 1876 at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, wearing no insignia, speaking fluent Lakota, and carrying a medallion marked with the Ouroboros crucifix. Are you seeing the pattern? They weren't just stealing boys. They were seeding agents. The seminary was a front, a crucible to dissolve the self, forge an empty vessel, and refill it with ideological flame. Not spiritual, political. And the ones who paid the most didn't want saints. They wanted loyal ghosts. Now, we trace it forward. Because what began in stone chambers beneath Illinois didn't stay buried. History is written by the victors. But the shadows are written by survivors, the few who make it out half-mad, burning with truths that history has no pages for. One of those survivors was a man named Elijah Crow. Officially, Crow was never at Sacred Heart. No records, no baptismal entry, no enrollment log. But in 1906 he published a strange anonymous pamphlet titled The Unmade Cleric. Distributed in whispers through underground print shops in St. Louis, only 14 copies are known to exist. Every single one has a different number of pages, a different order, but one passage remains the same in every version. They took away my name with holy water, they burned my past in incense, and when I awoke beneath the earth I spoke only what they gave me. My hands trembled in prayer, but my tongue was not mine. I became a liturgy made of ash and order. That's not metaphor. It's programming. Crow describes rooms with no light, weeks without sleep, and liturgical mantras sung over loudspeakers for hours, until his own thoughts stopped feeling like his own. Priests in masks who spoke in pairs, switching mid-sentence. And above all else, the bell. He said it rang not from the tower, but from beneath, and every time it rang, someone was taken. Most chilling was what he called the room of mirrors. Not physical mirrors, mental ones. He wrote that each student was forced to watch as his personality was reconstructed in a reflected version. A false self, compliant and clean, that could pass as real even under scrutiny. A saint skin, he called it, worn like vestments. Now skeptics dismissed the pamphlet as madness, but in 2003, a retired Vatican archivist confessed, under anonymous protection, that the Unmade Cleric bore striking resemblance to a classified 1871 training protocol recovered from the Sacred Heart ruins, a document, and labeled Ad Umbra Deus, toward the God of Shadows. This protocol outlined a 6-phase identity collapse model used for field operatives in ecclesiastical territory and beyond. And it wasn't just theological. It included modules in foreign dialect mimicry, emotional suppression, political infiltration, and even, disturbingly, intimate manipulation of target populations. Yes, they weren't training priests. They were training handlers. Spiritual agents embedded in communities not to serve God, but to redirect belief, steer populations, manipulate mass perception. And what happens when these agents are no longer needed? They vanish again, back into the silence, back into the tunnels, back into the system that made them. You beginning to see it now? Sacred Heart wasn't a seminary. It was a birth canal for human weapons, and its blueprint was just getting started. There's a difference between silence and engineered absence. One is forgetting, the other is deletion. After Sacred Heart's quiet erasure, most believe the horror ended in fire and ruins, but that's because they don't understand how institutional memory works. The church may have burned the building, the state may have paved over the land, but the method was archived, not in Illinois, not in Rome, in Washington, D.C. In 1949, during a Senate subcommittee hearing on foreign psychological operations, a single document was submitted by mistake. It was meant to be redacted, misfiled. But for 6 minutes it was public record before being sealed again. The document's title: Continuity of Ritual Compliance Systems in Faith-Based Populations, 1865 to 1947. You read that right. Not conversion, not religious instruction. Compliance. Page 17 details the Sacred Heart model as a case study in embedded psycho-spiritual conditioning, citing its effectiveness in producing post-ritual behavioral alignment across language, class, and even prior ideological resistance. The document goes further, stating, subject responses to sacramental stressors and subterranean sensory deprivation produced dissociative states consistent with modern definitions of programmable subpersonalities. They weren't just breaking men, they were splitting them. And here's where it crosses from disturbing to global. 3 years after this document was locked away, Project Artichoke was launched, the precursor to MK Ultra. Its stated purpose: to study whether an individual could be made to perform acts, including assassination, against their will. But buried in the project's foundation was a list of source methodologies. First on the list, SH Codex Rites I-4. That's Sacred Heart. The rites weren't spiritual, they were neurological frameworks, when tied to confession, communion, obedience, penance. Think about it. Rituals designed to create euphoria, shame, obedience, and surrender over years. These weren't flaws in Catholicism. They were repurposed tools. Language, kneeling, repetition, touch, reinterpreted as mechanisms of behavioral override. It was the perfect cover, because when a man breaks in church, people say he's having a revelation. When he breaks elsewhere, they say he's going mad. So what happens when these techniques are stripped of robes and crosses and inserted into education, into military training, into social media algorithms? Sound familiar? It should, because you're not watching this by accident. You've already been marked, and the deeper you go, the more your old identity burns away. That's not fear, that's transformation. You still want truth? Good. Because in the next section we expose the group still running the model today, not in cathedrals, but in tall boardrooms. They don't wear collars anymore, they wear suits, and the incense has been replaced by data. The men who took over the Sacred Heart model didn't disappear, they adapted. You don't bury a system that effective, you refine it, industrialize it, strip it of crosses and call it human resources. Rename confession personal onboarding, turn penance into performance reviews. You laugh, but ask yourself, when was the last time you told a stranger online your deepest fear, and why did it feel good? After the seminary fell and Vatican silence sealed its records, a strange thing happened in 1953. The Edison Behavioral Institute was quietly founded in upstate New York. Not medical, not academic, not listed on any university roll, but its founding board included 3 men, a disavowed Jesuit, a former OSS translator fluent in ancient Greek, and a corporate recruiter for Delano International, a company with deep defense contracts and zero public presence. Their goal: to develop repeatable behavioral influence systems applicable across faith, education, and commerce. What does that mean? It means they took what worked in the chapel and applied it to the CAD corporate pyramid. The isolation chambers became focus pods in Silicon Valley. The liturgical chants, repurposed as branded mission statements, repeated until employees say them in their sleep. The penance model, transformed into monthly KPIs, shame as motivation, and obedience to the church, replaced by obedience to systems. And you think it's just coincidence that major companies adopted phrases like phobid, faith in the mission, evangelist, disciples of disruption. They weren't innovating, they were imitating. From 1960 to 1991, the Edison Institute operated 27 experimental training camps under various names: leadership retreats, crisis immersion courses, elite mentoring programs. But each one was built on the Sacred Heart skeleton: psychological disassembly followed by identity reconstruction. One leaked curriculum from 1976 reads like scripture: the subject must first be made unsure of his name. Only then can the new title be received. Now you tell me, what's the modern title? User, consumer, brand ambassador, follower. And who's the new priesthood? Not clergy, executives. Think of every time you begged a system to notice you, clicked, liked, shared, confessed, apologized, swore to do better. They took the altar and turned it into an algorithm. And now, you worship every day. You just call it scrolling. In the next section, we'll expose the real inheritors of Sacred Heart. Not religious, not government, but invisible. A brotherhood that never died, and you've probably seen their symbol without even knowing it. Symbols don't just represent power, they transmit it. Look closely. You've seen it. A circle devouring itself, sometimes in logos, sometimes hidden in negative space. An abstract spiral, a stylized cross, a looping figure curled into eternity. Sometimes it's wrapped in thorns, sometimes flame, sometimes light. The Ouroboros crucifix didn't vanish with Sacred Heart. It evolved. But its meaning never changed. It was always a mark of ownership. In 2011, an anonymous whistleblower, a data architect at a major behavioral marketing firm based in San Francisco, leaked an internal document titled Codex, Continuum Engagement Through Recursive Identity Collapse. It sounds like tech jargon, but it wasn't. Inside were diagrams. One showed a human profile, surrounded by concentric circles, each labeled with a phase 1, confession 2, isolation 3, ritual exposure 4, crisis induction 5, synthetic revelation 6, brand fusion. The final phase was the Ouroboros, closing the loop. They weren't selling products. They were selling new selves. Test audiences had no idea. Each ad was scripted like a sermon. Each app functioned like a chapel. Notifications became bells. Feedback loops became liturgy. Endless engagement meant endless obedience. Because as long as you were reacting, you weren't thinking. They had weaponized identity. And at the heart of it, a silent cabal known only by an acronym: SCRIPT. Sacramental Control, Ritualized Influence Programming Tribunal. Ridiculous, maybe, until you realize their registered parent shell company holds contracts with over 19 of the Fortune 100 pairs. Until you realize that their board includes a former Vatican financial liaison, a Department of Defense psychological warfare consultant, and 2 executives from early behaviorist research firms tracing back to, you guess, ADIT, the Edison Institute. And their emblem, a cross woven into a loop, half gold, half black, modern, clean, unthreatening. But traced backward through glyphs found in Sacred Heart's crypt, it matches an ancient sigil for compliance through sanctified deception. This isn't religion. It's ritual in disguise. Commerce as confession, marketing as mass. And you've already been initiated. Every account you create, every "I agree" you click, every digital "Yes, Father" disguised as a terms of service. The new church doesn't need pews, it needs users. In the next section, we go back, not to the church, but before the church, because Sacred Heart didn't invent this, they just inherited it. And the first priests weren't men at all. Before the church, before the cross, there was still the altar. Long before Sacred Heart rose from Illinois prairie stone, long before Latin prayers echoed through vaulted chapels, there were other sanctuaries, hidden in the dirt, carved into caves, drowned in the blood of goats and children. You see, the ritual isn't Catholic. It never was. The vestments, the incense, the Latin, costumes. The real ritual, the psychological machinery behind obedience, sacrifice, submission, predates Rome, predates Jerusalem, predates history as you know it. Let me take you back to Çatalhöyük, 7500 BC, one of the oldest known human settlements in what is now Turkey. Archaeologists uncovered a chamber, no windows, no tools, but the walls were painted with red handprints, all left hands. In the center, a raised stone slab, not for sleeping, not for eating, for witnessing. The bones surrounding the slab weren't random, they were sorted, skull, spine, pelvis, no full skeletons, just the centers of identity, removed, catalogued, arranged. This wasn't butchery, it was belief. And on the far wall, a symbol, the same looping spiral with a split cruciform center found beneath Sacred Heart 9,000 years later. The symbol has been found in Mesopotamia, beneath Incan temples, on Viking runestones, etched into the underside of Egyptian burial masks. Each time the culture changed, but the geometry didn't. It's not religious. It's neurological. A visual cue designed to activate a sense of sacred patterning in the human brain, triggering reverence, awe, submission. You weren't born with it. You were bred for it. And someone, something, has kept that symbol alive for over 10,000 years. Not priests, custodians. You don't know their names, but they have always existed, embedding the spiral in every empire, every economy, every belief system. Babylon, Rome, Constantinople, London, Washington, different names, same altar. And Sacred Heart? That was just the 19th century American version, their local chapter, a test site. Because the goal has never been worship. It's compliance through reverence. To kneel before what you do not question, to obey what you don't fully understand, to become grateful for your own captivity. And when obedience becomes pleasure, you never leave the system, you defend it. Next we reach the turning point, the moment Sacred Heart stopped being a local experiment and became national infrastructure. A priest vanished in 1861. He didn't die. He was promoted. Not all promotions lead upward. Some go on it deeper. Into rooms no doors enter. Into positions no rank reveals. His name was Father Isaac Bellamy. Officially, he was the seminary's ethics instructor, soft-spoken, scholarly, never once punished a student. His sermons were quiet, but razor-sharp, filled with paradoxes that made young men weep and doubt at the same time. He taught that virtue was measured not by actions, but by the ability to choose when unseen. He vanished on October 9, 1861. According to official church records, he was reassigned to a Jesuit mission in Oregon. But no such mission ever existed. No letter ever reached the Oregon diocese. No grave, no farewell. He simply disappeared until 1870, when he resurfaces under a different name. Bellismore. Listed as a civilian liaison to the U.S. Department of War's Behavioral Morale Unit. Same eyes, same voice, but no cassock, no crucifix. Instead, a black lapel pin, shaped like an incomplete circle, fractured at the top, matching the upper arc of the Sacred Heart spiral. What was Bellismore's role? Internal documents declassified in 2009 describe him as Director of Cognitive Conditioning Protocols for Rural Infantry Deployment. In plain terms, he was re-engineering spiritual obedience into military loyalty. His memos reference something called divine transfer conditioning. The thesis: the same ritual structures that produce monastic obedience can be secularized to command unbreakable loyalty under battlefield trauma. He authored a document labeled DH-22, Deployment Hymnals, which outlined battlefield routines, disguised as secular rituals. Morning recitation, A's liturgical replacement, squad oaths, Edo's confession substitutes, a rifle assembly with chant, Eel's sacramental calibration. By 1874, units trained under Bellismore's guidance had 42% low desertion rates and 68% higher fatality acceptance. These weren't braver soldiers. They were ritualized assets. And the most horrifying line in the file: belief is not required, only rhythm. Let that sink in. You don't need to believe anymore. You just need to repeat. Obedience without theology, submission without soul. Sacred Heart wasn't teaching faith, it was teaching a language of compliance, one that could be spoken in church, in the military, in corporate training, in politics. And Bellismore? He wasn't rogue, he was recruited. Absorbed into a hidden network of ideological engineers, all tracing their roots back to the seminary of disappearance. In the next section we ask, where did that network go? Because it didn't die in the 1800s, it changed its name. When power changes hands, it doesn't leave fingerprints, it leaves symbols. When it changes names, it doesn't announce itself, it whispers in code. After Bellamy became Bellismore, and after Sacred Heart was quietly condemned, something darker slithered from its ashes. Not a cult, not a church, but a structure. A transmission system without a face. It had no altar, no scripture, no holy days. It had protocols. Its name surfaced once, in a declassified 1965 CIA memorandum examining non-theistic behavioral loyalty systems. In that report, one footnote, unreferenced and surrounded by redactions, contains just 3 words: Order of the Veil. For decades, researchers dismissed it, a ghost entry, a formatting error. But in 1987, during a routine remodeling of a Jesuit retreat house in Quebec, workers discovered a sealed vault behind the chapel. Inside, hundreds of aged documents, half in Latin, half in English, all watermarked with a strange symbol, a cross, inverted but incomplete. The top sheared off and looped backward, forming the now familiar spiral. And at the top of every page, the same heading: Ordo Velatae Veritas, the Order of the Veiled Truth. The contents: global distribution charts, outlines for seminaries, military academies, boarding schools, and corporate leadership retreats, each categorized by obedience level and cycle penetration, programs in Argentina, Ontario, Virginia, Bavaria, even Karachi. One file titled RH13 marked Full Success Achieved, Spiritual Surrender with Zero Theological Framing, Agent Believes Obedience is Enlightenment. This was post-religious control, pure psychological ritual, stripped of meaning, until all that remained was the motion. And who funded it? You won't like the answer. A list of benefactors was enclosed, some still operating today under different names. The Eshel Group, now part of BlackRock Behavioral Futures Division. The Laetare Foundation, renamed the Resilio Initiative. Aurelius Holdings, with known ties to Defense Analytics, Ritual Architecture, and Human Predictive Programming Models. Every single donor had one thing in common: ties to legacy Catholic bloodlines from the 1800s. The order didn't reject the church, it outgrew it. Where Sacred Heart had 19 victims in 18 years, the order absorbed on thousands in silence, not to kill them, but to reformat them. Ask yourself, why do so many men rise to positions of influence and speak like they've been trained to obey something invisible? Why do whistleblowers suddenly recant under mysterious circumstances? Why do CEOs weep during interviews and say things like, "I was chosen"? Because the seminary didn't die. It went private. And in the next section we meet a man who defected, the only one to ever survive the order's inner ring, and speak. He spoke only once. One interview, no recordings, just a transcript smuggled from a burned clinic outside Zurich. The man's name? Unknown. His code name? Thorn. He claimed to have entered the Order of the Veil in 1973, not as a victim, not as clergy, as an engineer. His background? Behavioral neurotheology, a field so obscure it doesn't officially exist. He was recruited after publishing a paper on ritual-induced suggestibility thresholds under a pseudonym. A week later, he was flown to a compound in northern France. Not a monastery, a conversion facility. He called it The Well, a 5-level subterranean compound with no religious iconography, no crucifixes, no priests. Only robes, architects, and rhythm. Every hour, chimes. Every day, one meal. Every night, a group chant, not in Latin, but in phonetic syllables mathematically mapped to brainwave frequencies. Thorn's job? To help develop what the order called liturgical dissolution models, or LDMs. Their goal? To remove the ego without deity, to produce surrender without faith, to construct loyalty without love. You see, the original Sacred Heart system still depended on spiritual belief, but belief is fragile. Belief asks questions. The order wanted something purer. They wanted a ritual that produced obedience whether or not the subject believed. That's when Thorn made his first mistake. He tried to leave. After 2 years, he realized the project wasn't academic. It was operational. The LDMs weren't theoretical. They were being used on boardroom recruits, military trainees, even political interns, but no one ever left the well, until Thorn did. He escaped during a fire drill, found refuge through an underground group of ex-order operatives called the Scattered Veil, mostly broken men who didn't remember their real names. He smuggled out one menu, Scriptures Dei, handwritten, 42 pages. In it, a single passage has become infamous among those who've seen it. They don't make priests anymore. They make vessels, empty containers. You don't obey because you believe. You obey because there's nothing left of you that knows how not to. Thorn died in 1997. Official cause, self-inflicted wounds. But the autopsy report? Missing. His manuscript disappeared from archives in 2001. The doctor who treated him committed suicide 5 days later. His final note read, "The liturgy follows us." You still think this is about the church? The church was just a rehearsal. The real performance? You're living in it. And if you've followed this far, you're not the same person who started. Now prove it. In the comments, write, "My will is my own." Then write it again. My will is my own. Because now we go deeper. Next, what the Vatican knew and why they let it happen. The Vatican did not lose control. It surrendered it, quietly, willingly, in exchange for something far more dangerous than power. It's one of the most uncomfortable truths buried beneath the ruins of Sacred Heart, that the Church knew exactly what was happening. Not only knew, facilitated. To understand why, you must step back into 1859, 2 years before Father Bellamy vanished, and 3 before the seminary mysteriously burned. A letter exists. Its authenticity was confirmed in 2003 by papal archivists working off record. Its contents have never been officially released, but a copy made its way to a closed symposium of religious historians in Brussels. Only 2 pages. Addressed from Cardinal Armand Lucenti, Secretary of the Holy Congregation for Seminarian Affairs, to King Archbishop Giuseppe Dandolo, Vatican Envoy to North America. Subject line: concerning the irregular operations of Sacred Heart and their influence on post-initiatory obedience patterns. One line haunts the entire letter. What they have uncovered in Illinois is not heresy, it is utility. Cardinal Lucenti's tone is not fearful, it's clinical, almost admiring. He writes, These methods, though unsanctioned, have revealed a purity of result our rites have long sought but failed to produce. The conditioning of identity under symbolic deprivation yields a servant not only obedient to Christ, but to any command cloaked in sacred cadence. Let that sink in. The Vatican had been watching Sacred Heart, quietly, taking notes. Because to them, it wasn't a crisis, it was a prototype. The letter closes with something even darker. Should the order expand beyond its current scope, it must do so outside ecclesiastical visibility. We will not condemn what may later serve us. The gospel can wait. Obedience cannot. Obedience, not faith. This was the Vatican's quiet deal with the machine. They didn't bless it, but they didn't stop it either. Because what Sacred Heart proved was that ritual without belief still works. And if it works, it can be but weaponized. And in 1922 it was, under the guise of a Vatican-aligned advisory board called the Comissio Obscura, officially disbanded in 1947. Unofficially, absorbed into the Office for Religious Intelligence, a ghost department with no budget line, no public address, and unrestricted access to theological research black sites across Europe and South America. These sites conducted what they called secular faith trials. Their goal, to build a godless church. Network of influence, ritual, and compliance that needed no Christ, no creed, no salvation, just architecture, timing, repetition, and trauma. And you wonder why modern institutions feel holy even when they're empty. Because the framework is still there. In the next section, we turn to the last living man known to have visited the Sacred Heart crypt before it was sealed forever. He didn't come out clean, but he did come out changed. He entered on a dare. He came out muttering verses no scripture had ever written. The man's name was Dr. Elias Rourke, and what he saw beneath Sacred Heart was never meant to be witnessed by the human mind. Rourke was no mystic, no conspiracy theorist. He was a professor of architectural anthropology at a Midwestern university, known for his dry lectures and disdain for religious symbolism. In 1982, during a field study on early ecclesiastical construction, he obtained restricted access to the ruins of Sacred Heart Seminary, now sealed off for safety reasons, they claimed. Hidden mold, structural decay, radiation even. The excuses changed, depending on who asked. But Rourke was persistent. He had contacts, and eventually he was granted one day, 24 hours, to descend into what the church had buried beneath 400 tons of stone, gravel, and silence. He never published the report, but fragments of his private journal leaked in 1995 after his mysterious disappearance, pages found scattered across the inside of his abandoned home, burned in places, torn in others, smeared with something that tested positive for ox blood. One entry reads, "The crypt is not a room, it is a resonant chamber. The walls vibrate with inaudible frequency, a hum you can't hear but can feel like your own bones are whispering back." He described geometric grooves, carved deep into the limestone, not decorative, functional. When light from his flashlight hit them just right, they appeared to ripple, as if folding space. Some sections seemed mathematically impossible, curves that should not converge, did. But the most disturbing detail, in the center of the crypt was a bad seat. Not a throne, not a chair, a recessed stone cavity, perfectly molded to fit a human body in the fetal position. Above it, an arch lined with embedded iron crucifixes, all bent eyes, into spirals, not broken, but intentionally twisted, almost melted. Around the seat, Rourke wrote, were Chao names, not in Latin, not in English, but in a form of pre-phonetic glyph work. The same structure found in ruins beneath Çatalhöyük, and eerily similar to patterns discovered on tablets in pre-dynastic Abydos. He traced one name. It bled. He wrote, "The seat is not a relic. It's an interface. It doesn't worship. It doesn't punish. It or programs. What kind of God needs a chair to rewrite the mind? After exiting the crypt, Rourke never taught again. He spent the rest of his days wandering national parks, sketching spiral patterns into the dirt, whispering the same phrase over and over. The liturgy is geometry. The priesthood is rhythm. Before his disappearance, a neighbor recorded him screaming one night, "They built the seminary on a throat, and it's still breathing." In the next section, we explore what that throat might be. Not metaphor, but structure. Not theology. An ancient machine. It was never a chapel. It was never a school. Sacred Heart Seminary was a casing, a body. But beneath it, something was alive, something ancient, something built not to pray but to transmit. We must now speak of the bomb throat mechanism. The term used in fragments of Vatican engineering logs dated between 1852 and 1863. Only 11 pages survive, translated from a mixture of medieval Latin and archaic ecclesiastical code language. In every mention, the throat is referred to not as a metaphor, but as an active system, a resonant basin, located directly beneath the seminary's original chapel. According to the documents, this substructure was not built by the church. It was discovered, buried beneath the prairie, older than any local records, older than any known European or indigenous foundation in the area. When the seminary's early architects broke ground for the altar's foundation, they encountered the chamber. It was already there, perfectly symmetrical. A 7-sided void, lined with smooth stone that tested as non-local, not limestone, not granite, but an unknown metamorphic blend that absorbs sound and reflects heat at unnatural angles. And in the center, a shaft. 40 feet deep, 12 feet wide, perfectly vertical, lined with mineral composites laced with traces of silver, iron, and something no geologist could name. Something non-reactive, unidentifiable, yet clearly processed. The first builders, the real priests, before the impostors arrived, attempted to bless the space. They failed. The water wouldn't hold its blessing. Crucifixes blackened when lowered in, and when Gregorian chants were sung above it, the echo came back wrong. Distorted, reversed, and often changed. The Vatican logs refer to it as vox antiqua, the ancient voice, and it was active. Sensors placed at the rim of the shaft recorded a pulsing magnetic frequency every 19 minutes and 23 seconds. No known natural resonance fits that interval. The implications? The throat was not a tomb. It was a transceiver, a structure designed to send and receive ritual energy. Not light, not sound, but patterned behavior, emotional sacrifice, chanted rhythm, obedience. All that ceremony, all those vanished priests, they weren't victims, they were fuel. Think. Why was Sacred Heart so elaborate for its time? Why so remote? Why so secretive? Because they weren't just training priests. They were charging something. And the spiral, the twisted crucifix, those weren't symbols of faith. They were keys. In the next section, we go inside the pattern and show you how it didn't end in 1863. Because the throat is still humming. You thought the seminary was gone. You thought the fire ended it. But fire doesn't erase geometry, and symbols don't burn, they migrate. After Sacred Heart's accidental blaze in 1863, officials declared the site cursed. No further institutions were permitted to build there. The land was purchased quietly by a Chicago-based Catholic investment trust, then left untouched for over 120 years. Until 1984, a new project began under a different name. Stilling Heights Youth Rehabilitation Center. Not a seminary, not a chapel, a behavioral correctional facility for troubled teenage boys. The building was brutalist concrete, sterile and windowless. But the blueprint? A near-perfect overlay of Sacred Heart's original Gothic layout. 7 chambers, 3 towers, a central nave, and in the exact same spot where the altar once stood, a reinforced steel cylinder extending into the earth, 40 feet down. One contractor quit mid-construction. His written testimony was buried in a civil complaint, never publicized. It read, "I don't care if you believe me. That shaft wasn't made with our equipment. The walls were already cut, already smoothed. The readings from our sonar didn't make sense. Depth kept shifting, like it was moving while we worked." He wasn't the only one. Over the next 5 years, 14 boys disappeared from Stilling Heights. Each time the administration claimed they were runaways, no search parties, no local alerts. And each time, the exact same weather pattern. Pressure drops, static electricity in the air, and a faint vibration at 19-minute intervals. Too low to hear, but enough to make metal fixtures hum like a prayer half-remembered. And then the audio logs. A whistleblower, known only as D, leaked recordings from the facility's therapeutic sessions in 1991. One tape, titled Subject 7, Induced Reflection, feature as a boy speaking in fluent Latin, despite no formal training. He repeats the same sentence over and over, "Vox venit non excorde, sed ex profundo." The voice comes not from the heart, but from the deep. It gets worse, because D wasn't just a janitor or nurse. He was a preclinical behavioral programmer, formerly trained in military ritual synchronization protocols, and in his final recorded statement before vanishing in 1993, he wrote, "Sacred Heart never closed. It hid. And now the spiral's reactivating, not in churches, but bound in systems. Prisons, schools, hospitals, algorithms. Anywhere ritual can pass for policy. Think about your daily routine, your workplace, your phone. How many patterns do you follow without thinking? Because pattern is prayer. And prayer, when hollowed of belief, becomes submission. In the next section, we trace the spiral as it reached Silicon Valley and how the very platforms you're watching this on may be extensions of the same design. You thought the altar was stone. You thought the ritual needed candles. But what if the new chapel is a screen? What if the spiral didn't end in the dirt? It just learned to code. Welcome to the new seminary. It's not in Illinois. It's in your pocket. Let's be clear. The pattern never stopped. It evolved. Sacred Heart was the beta test. Stilling Heights was the dark reboot. And in the early 2000s, it went digital, not through religion, but through interface. Here's what they learned. You don't need to chant anymore. You don't need to kneel. You just need to scroll. The spiral is now embedded in the rhythm of your day. Swipe, tap, wait, refresh. Every dopamine loop, every notification delay, every infinite scroll mechanism, they all follow the same neurological cadence first mapped in the liturgy of obedience at Sacred Heart Seminary. Delay longing, reward submission. These aren't just features, they're rituals. And it's not just random. In 2008, leaked documents from a behavioral consulting firm contracted by Meta, then Facebook, revealed something chilling. Subjective compliance increases 3.6x when the user is exposed to structured loops of 3, image, icon, affirmation. This replicates early Catholic tripartite initiatory stimuli. In simpler terms, Trinity-based control. They modeled neural compliance on religious architecture, not because it's spiritual, but because it's effective. But here's the kicker. The same symbol. The broken crucifix spiral now appears in digital watermarking algorithms embedded in certain ad networks. These aren't public. They exist in machine-readable code. But whistleblowers from ad tech giants have confirmed it. A ghost signature, sequence 19BX, also called throat indexing protocol. And what does it do? It doesn't rack clicks. It doesn't gather data. It measures emotional resonance into 19-minute cycles, just like the wood shaft, just like burn the throat. You've felt it. The sudden emotional spike after 19 minutes of doom scrolling, the unexplainable sense of submission, like something is watching, waiting, humming just beneath your consciousness. It's not just surveillance, it's liturgy, digital, invisible, and but voluntary. You don't kneel anymore. You agree to terms, to conditions, to cycles you never wrote. And the scariest part, you're not the user, you're the subject. Because in the next section, we'll reveal how one of the architects of modern UX design, hailed as a genius in Silicon Valley, was the great-grandson of a Sacred Heart priest, and his breakthrough wasn't innovation, it was inheritance. You think technology is progress, you think design is convenience, but what if what you touch every day was shaped by hands that once drew blood in God's name? Let me introduce you to Nathaniel R. Kearney, MIT graduate, co-founder of several early UX firms, one of the minds behind the soft loop interface that made endless scrolling not just possible, but pleasurable. He's been called the father of frictionless design. But what no one tells you is this. Kearney was born in 1973 in Joliet, Illinois. His great-grandfather, Father Alaric Kearney, one of the last documented instructors at Sacred Heart Seminary before its closure. Alaric's name doesn't appear in public seminary records, but it does appear in the Vatican sealed Index Obscurata, a ledger of clergy reassigned to silence. Nathaniel never spoke publicly about his lineage, but in 2007, during a quiet keynote at a private behavioral science retreat in Davos, Switzerland, he reportedly said something that chilled the room. My great-grandfather trained in rituals. I train in inputs. Either way, you're shaping the soul's response to patterned expectation. Let that sink in. Inputs equals rituals. And souls? Not religious, not moral, just responsive units. Kearney's approach to design was not about usability, it was about invisible coercion. His systems weren't built to help you, they were built to train you, subtly, rhythmically, liturgically. One of his original design team members, under anonymity, leaked Kearney's personal design framework. It was called the OBEX model, short for obedience, belief suspension, emotional echo, exit denial, the same 4 stages, outlined in Sacred Heart's original indoctrination manual, recovered from beneath the seminary's chapel floorboards in 1969. Kearney didn't invent anything. Gitized an ancient rite. One log from his development notes reads, users shouldn't be able to tell the difference between consent and surrender. Another, make the experience so smooth they mistake indoctrination for convenience. You've felt it. That numbing drift when you're 20 minutes into an app and can't remember why you opened it. That invisible hook that drags you back when you try to quit. The cycle. The spiral. The throat. It's not a bug. It's heritage. And it's everywhere now. Because Nathaniel Kearney didn't just leave a legacy of design. He left code, embedded in early SDKs that still form the spine of most mobile apps today. Sacred Heart lives on, in your hand. In the next section, we trace how psychological liturgies migrated from the church to the state, and how prisons, schools, and corporate HR departments became ritual enforcers of the same system. When the church lost control of the spiral, the state stepped in, but they didn't dismantle it, they repurposed it, because once you realize obedience can be engineered, why stop at religion? Let's talk about the migration of the rite. How Sacred Heart's psychological liturgies, born in blood and ritual, passed seamlessly into modern institutions we trust without question. Not by accident, by design. Let's start in 1956, the year the U.S. Department of Corrections implemented a new behavioral compliance protocol called tiered moral restructuring. On paper, it was about rehabilitation. But in its original draft, written by a task force led by a Jesuit-educated psychologist named Dr. Matthew Colt, it was described as a civic rite of purification through structured deprivation, controlled silence, and ritualized reward loops. Sound familiar? It should, because the program was modeled directly after Sacred Heart's original disciplinary cycle: isolation, denial of comfort, structured repetition, conditional approval. You may know it by its modern name: solitary confinement. But it didn't stop there. In Charton 1971, after the Stanford prison experiment revealed just how quickly people submit to hierarchical authority and symbolic structure, the findings were quietly co-opted by big corporate HR departments. A classified white paper from Rand Corporation, labeled Liturgical Structure in Non-Religious Environments, outlined how employee onboarding could mimic initiation rites: ceremonial welcome, symbolic dress code, codified silence in meetings, mandatory affirmation rituals, core values, team building, mission statements. The goal, not productivity, compliance. Because Sacred Heart taught them, you don't need belief, you just need patterned reverence. Enter the public education system. By 1983, the Department of Education rolled out a pilot program in 12 states, predictive discipline protocols. It used behavior tracking, biometric monitoring, and pattern recognition to preempt student misconduct. But internal memos described something darker. We're not punishing behavior, we're eroding autonomy, preconditioning minds to expect correction, even when no wrongdoing exists. And where did they learn that? A buried footnote cites moral theology observations from Sacred Heart's lost seminarian files. You see the shape now, don't you? Sacred Heart was not destroyed. It was but disseminated. Every time you're asked to recite a mission, every time you're ranked against your peers, every time you wait for approval that never quite arrives, you're in the chapel, you're in the spiral, you're at the throat. In the next section, we'll expose the initiation phrase, hidden in modern language, a symbolic script buried in common speech, designed to trigger submission at a subconscious level. And if you hear yourself say it, you're already under the liturgy.